Good evening. Good evening. Here I am, your instructor for American Literature and Culture. I'm Aisha Iqbal Vishamohan, and I'm delighted to meet you finally. And this is our 1 hour live interaction session. I hope that you are enjoying the course so far and you are responding to our questions. There are assignments to be done, and I have seen your assignments. Uh, uh, I can sense that you people are into the course and you are enjoying. And today we are here for a couple of queries. Before we start, um, let me tell you, or just give you a short briefing of what, how are we going to function? I mean, like, we are going to have questions, right? Yeah. So we are going to receive questions.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So we are going to receive questions as I talk, and you can keep sending me your questions. I will be responding to some questions that I already have. One of the questions that I received was, what are the, just someone asked me to give a brief overview of the history of American literature and also highlight the main literary periods in American literature. Yeah, so it's difficult because uh, just imagine the outline or the sheer size of America, the United States of America. And you have to remember that America, uh, because of its size, because of its huge geographical size, um, it is difficult to pinpoint exactly the kind of uh, literature that America produces. So that it's not a monolithic kind of literature because of its various distinct geographical locations. So it's not one cannot assume that, look, this is a place from where these things, this particular genre or this idea originated. Is quite difficult to um, sort of locate that. However, to make things easier for us, scholars have given us a couple of periods. So, one is the colonial period when America was still ruled by the British. So, America was a British colony. You remember that? This period is from 1607 to 1775. This is the colonial period, and it encompasses the founding of Jamestown and up to the Revolutionary War. There was an American War of Independence, so that's called the Revolution, American Revolution. So the colonial period, and Cotton Mather is one of the earliest writers of this period, um, and Bradstreet, and also William Bradford. We also have a couple of slave narratives at this time, although none of them are so popular and famous as some of the slave narratives that would appear much later, that would get published much later. So the colonial period, and this was followed by the revolutionary age, 1765 to 1790. Now, you have to remember that this period, I mean, not exactly during, but a little bit before this period, the so-called Revolutionary Age. The period included the writings of people like Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton. So these are the founding fathers of America. And remember, all these names that I mentioned, they are not just literary writers, but they were, Thomas Jefferson, of course, everyone knows who he is. So what I'm trying to say is that this is one of the richest periods in American history, known for its political writing. And of course, you have to remember the Declaration of Independence. So this is one of the key publication or key writings of this period. Um, Period from 1775 to 1820 as we move further. So this era is responsible for a couple of notable first works, and one work is particularly for the stage. So the contrast by Royal Taylor, and then the first American novel, The Power of Sympathy by William Hill. And then, of course, you have Washington Irving, the writer of Rip Van Winkle and also Sleepy Hollow. So, Washington Irving, and also don't forget James Fenimore Cooper, who had written the Leather Stocking Tales. So, these are the key writers of this particular period. Then we have the American Renaissance, and this is considered one of the most important periods in American literature. Mm, At the forefront are people such as Emerson, Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and um, Edgar Allan Poe, and of course Walt Whitman. So this is called the period of the American Renaissance. Renaissance of what? Renaissance, as you know, literally it means rebirth. So rebirth of what? It's like America waking up to its own distinct literature. So, and also one of the most key features of American thought and literature is the idea of individualism. They talk less about man in society, but it's more like an individual versus society. Many of the greatest American uh, literary heroes, as they appear in great works of art, in cinema, in literature, in theater, they are people who stand almost like outside the society. So much of this idea, it owes to itself to, or it lends itself to the idea of the American Renaissance writers, Thoreau, Emerson, and Herman Melville and Walt Whitman, who celebrated individualism. And this period also marks a distinct break from the British tradition. So the idea that just because they have the same and the common language, that's the English language, so that just because they have a common language, it doesn't mean that they are same. They express themselves in the same language, but not necessarily, they do not necessarily express the same ideas. Um, Next important period after the Renaissance is the realistic period. You have to remember the key name is Mark Twain, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, The Prince and the Pauper, and of course, one of the most defining novels of American literature, one of the most loved novels of American literature, that is The Adventures of Tilbury Finn. So, Mark Twain, and also the period saw the emergence of regional writers such as Kate Shopping, and Mary Wilkins Freeman, and Bret Hart. And of course, you had another master poet um, writing during the same period, that is Emily Dickinson. The emergence of several women writers. Kate Shopping, as you know, is also one of the foremost feminist writers, the author of The Awakening and Other Stories. The realistic period was followed by the naturalist period, and some of the important names are um, Jack London, Frank Norris, and Theodore Dreiser. And we have done Dreiser's work, An American Tragedy. Naturalism, as you know, it talks about, um, to quote Emile Zola, um, to whom naturalism owes a lot. So it refers to something called the concept of la bête humaine, the human animal. Every human being has an animal within, and it just at a particular time, at a particular period, this animal just comes out. So while the realists talk about essential nobility in human nature, the naturalists are all about addressing the animal instincts and how um, human beings are all about survival of the fittest. You remember Darwin's theory, survival of the fittest. So it talks about the same. Any questions we have so far?
No, no, no.
Okay. And this is also a period, and we have done this important writer, Edith Wharton, right? Edith Wharton, whose The Age of Innocence we had done. And Edith Wharton, as we were talking, as we have already discussed in several of our classes, owes a lot to her mentor, Henry James. Henry James and Edith Wharton. So, quite similar, but also quite different. So Henry James is more of a realist, and Edith Wharton is generally mentioned as one of the foremost. I mean, her work is there is an overlap of realism and naturalism. If you read her work, such as House of Mirth and Ethan Frome, then you will realize how close she is to Dreiser, although not in depiction of the social classes, but the depiction of the society in its bare animalistic tradition, in its bare teeth and claws. So there is a lot of which that is common between Edith Wharton and people like Dreiser, the naturalist Dreiser and Frank Norris. We move on to then the modern period, and the modernists are who started playing around with the form. See, the idea remained the same. What was introduced by the transcendentalists, the writers of the key thinkers of the American Renaissance. Still, mm, uh, the man versus nature idea, but by the time the literary period moved into the so-called modern period, roughly from 1914 to 1939. So just you can think of uh, the beginning of the First World War, and um, uh, America on the verge of the Second World War. So the First World War till the beginnings of the First World War and the beginnings of the Second World War. So 1914 to 1939, everything in between. So we call that the modern period. Now E. E. Cummings, Ezra Pound, Robert Frost, William Carlos Williams, Carl Sandburg, T.S. Eliot, Wallace Stevens, and these are the main poets. And remember, all these poets have been celebrated for the kind of groundbreaking works they did in terms of uh, form and technique. So they reinvented the poetic form and technique. For example, if you think of Pound's cantos, and if you think of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland or E. Cummings, so the way they played around with um, the syntax, the grammar, the punctuations, uh, in order, all these are disjointed and fragmented kinds of syntax to denote a fragmented and disjointed way of or view of life. So those are the modernists. And of course, I'm sure you remember Fitzgerald, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and novelists such as Hemingway. And we often talk about the jazz age, the roaring 20s. The Great Gatsby is the foremost work of the jazz age. We were talking about in one of our classes about the lost generation. So perhaps we haven't come to that period. Okay, but we will soon. So the lost generation and the major writers such as William Carlos Williams and also mm, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway. So these are the writers of the lost generation. You can also include Thomas Wolfe, Sherwood Anderson, Gertrude Stein, and William Faulkner. Mm. Uh, UGC, wait a minute. My question is about cultural studies, the 8 unit in the updated syllabus of UGC NET. What is UGC NET here? Have we, for you, is it a question regarding Jitu? Can you rephrase your question? I'm also confused regarding cultural studies. Is it a part of my course? Are you getting confused about my course? My course is called American Literature and Culture, right? Yeah, it is got nothing to do with cultural studies. Can you come back again? Can you just rephrase your question and they can see me and hear me, right? Yeah. Are they writing? Brishti and Jitu Mishra explain the difference between, yeah, that I will do that. Difference between interior monologue and stream of consciousness. Interior monologue is when a person, they makes a conversation, and a stream of consciousness. Interior monologue is when a person thinks of a dialogue within. Stream of consciousness is broken and fragmented thoughts, technically. I'm still waiting for someone to explain to me why this question came up. Cultural studies regarding what? Please explain the context of the question. I have been talking about the periods because there was a question about. Please give us some details of the periods. So, periods in American literature. While I wait for your questions, there is a question by some a candidate, by a student who says, I would like to prepare a research proposal on American literature. How will I choose the best writer for my research study? Now, this question comes up very often, very frequently. How will I choose the best writer for my research study? It's Yeah, thank you, Sanyukta. But I would still want you to look it up for the details. So to prepare a research proposal on American literature. One thing that I would like all of you who are people who are interested in doing PhD in American literature or in any literature, don't think of the best writer that you should work on. Think of a theme. Think of a particular theme or idea, or take a topic. You don't have to get into the trap of, look, this is a writer who no one has ever worked before, so I want to work. I mean, that's not a very uh, advisable way of getting into research, because if you think that no one has ever worked on a particular American writer, I'm sure someone somewhere is already working on it. I mean, in this world, I'm sure somebody is working on a writer or an author that you want to work on. So there's no such thing as being extremely original. But where you can bring the originality is the way you address a theme or a topic. So think of a topic. If you really want me to suggest, then perhaps some of the writers recently who have won the Pulitzer Prize for literature, perhaps it's a good way of looking at if you can find a common ground in the works of these particular authors who have won the Pulitzer Prize in recent years. Maybe that could make for a good research area. But still, think of a topic first. For example, many people like to work on food. Okay, food as a marker of identity in American literature, right? Brishti Mukherjee, you are saying you're confused regarding cultural studies. Please repeat your question, exactly what you mean and from where. Is it regarding my course, or are you talking about what is cultural studies? Please type in your question more elaborately. Thank you. Okay, so I hope I have responded to this this question of research topic. Then author called Colson Whitehead for my research study, but I cannot identify a specific theme in his writing. So I'm not able to connect his works with any other theme in my proposal. Um, but if you think that you have already selected an author called Colson Whitehead for your research study, um, uh, uh, still you would maybe, if you can't find a theme, then perhaps try to look at the techniques. Perhaps try to look at the narrative techniques, or perhaps try to look at the language that this particular author employs. If you can't find a common theme running through his novels, then perhaps you can find a common technique. There's a great American writer who has written novels such as uh, The Road, okay, and No Country for Old Men, and Blood Simple, Cormac McCarthy. Now, he is known for the undercurrents of dark elements in his works. So, ma'am, I want to know what means of cultural studies, and I want to know what is cultural studies and what are the books we need to read. Uh, there is a book by it has been brought up by Routledge Publications, and it's called uh, Theories of Cultural Studies, I think. And if you look up the internet, you will come across several books on cultural studies. John Story, for example, has written a book called Key Concepts. Not exactly key concept, but I think theory. of popular culture and culture studies. So John's story is one person. Culture studies, Brishti and Jitu Mishra is a very diffused and very eclectic term. What is culture? So culture can encompass several things. For example, I just mentioned food studies. Food is a part of culture, travel is a part of culture, buildings and roads are part of culture, streets, there is people have done PhDs on the street culture. So culture is something that is part of our everyday life, everyday discourse. We talk about music culture, we talk about popular culture, cinema is a part of culture. So, cultural studies is a broad term that encompasses all this and much more. We have things such as um, um, British culture studies and American culture studies, European culture studies. So there are lots and lots of areas for culture studies. So every nation has its peculiar brand of culture studies. There's a book on culture studies, which is a definitive kind of book. It's by is by someone called Simon During. Simon During. It's an edited volume. It has several um, uh, authors contributing to on various aspects of cultural studies. So these are the books. Uh, there is a query which says which asks about I'm pursuing MA from IGNU and preparing for UGC NET exam. I think my course is a very useful course for preparing for UGC NET. Can you please tell me what are the good universities to study my PhD and also the required criteria? I wouldn't get into what are the good universities, but I think you need to have a first class MA and you need to have a written exam, written on face-to-face interviews. So all these are criterion. So I think you have to read a lot, you have to prepare a lot, make sure that whatever you have learnt in your MA by way of texts and theories you know very well, and perhaps you can get into it. I'm sure that for net preparation, because the question is specific to how to prepare for net studies, JRF and net, there are books. There are a couple of books that I have seen which are which focus on preparing for exams. I think that would be good. American literature and American English literature both means the same. There is another question: is American literature and American English literature? See, the way you have framed the question, Rishti, American literature uh, from America, of course. American English literature. Now, of course, English is the language of the US. So, American English literature. Let me tell you something. American English is, if I just take off this American English literature from your question, American English is generally considered a different kind of English from British English. So, if you look at it that way, then American English is different from British English. But if you ask the literature part of it, American literature has to be the same as American English literature. But American literature is not the same as British literature or English literature as it is commonly taught in most universities in India and abroad. Abroad also, we have a very strong, we have a strong culture of American literature as well as British literature. Generally, what we call English literature here is British literature in other parts of the world, because they are very careful about the distinction. So here in English literature would generally mean that literature which is written in English. Of course, now things are changing. So if when there is something called literature in English, it means necessarily those that literature which has been written in English, not in any other language. I have a question which asks me, how does American literature differ or vary from British literature? America, now you look at, consider the sheer size of America, the United States of America, and you also consider uh, historically how young the US is. So it's a huge country, and it's also, relatively speaking, a young country. Okay, it was discovered quite late, whereas other countries, they have the historical and heritage of thousands of years, but not America. Whereas British literature is okay. There's a question. Maybe identify American literature, its contribution to world literature, somewhat certain distinct features, typically American in nature. Typical American in nature, the theme of individualism. That is typical American. You see, when you talk about world literature, man is generally in conflict with himself. When you think of the works of the great Irish writer James Joyce, or when you think of great French writers like Camus, uh, and all these existentialist philosophers, and and the works of Kafka, also great German writers, and most of the themes are like man in conflict with himself. American literature is all about individualism, so that is the major difference. American literature contains works which are translated into. Does American literature contain works which are translated into English? I don't understand this question. Does American English literature contain works which are translated into English? It is English, so why should we translate it? Perhaps you would like to rephrase this question. So, coming back to this Urmi Batra's question, contribution to world literature. Now, if I look at certain key American authors, and some of them we have already done in this course. Now, if we think of Faulkner, we think of Hemingway, consider the way they have reinvented the English language, and also the way they have drawn attention to the specific regions from where they came from. So whether it's Mark Twain or Faulkner or Hemingway or Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald basically wrote about, he was very cosmopolitan, so he would travel, he had traveled a lot, and he was exposed to a lot of um, countries and various kinds of people. So all that seeped into his literature, his writings. So Bharat, that is the contribution of So each American author is extremely individualistic, and one of the major contribution has to be in the way they have reinvented the English language. So, how does American, coming back to the question, how does American literature vary from British literature? So, because of its size and because of the fact that America is relatively a new country, mm, and when we compare it with British literature, which has the way we know British literature today, so we go back to the times of Chaucer. Okay, so there's a huge difference. There's huge difference between British literature and American literature. So by way of there, because see, when Americans started writing, when they were taking baby steps towards writing literature, British literature was already very well established. So we already had people who were like, who had acquired great fame. For example, Shakespeare. For example, Milton. Okay, so also think of the kind of work that, for example, Milton has written Paradise Lost, an epic. Um, in American literature, with the exception of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which we have done a couple of chapters in our course, we really don't have anything which is like, which we can call a true epic. The reason is simple because mm, an epic requires a sense of vast proportion, and America, although it's a huge country, but they are more into their addressing the local and the regional issues. Of course there are universal ideas also, but not of epic proportions. Things written in some languages, if translated by an American, can we include it in the genre of American literature? Mm, for example, look, I will give you an example, Brishti. We have hyphenated identities. So, not written in other languages, but written in English, written in English, and by people whose nationality is American, but they bring their unique perspective. By unique perspective, I mean uh, the sense of belonging to their parent country. Example, Bharti Mukherjee or Jampa Lahiri, they are Americans and they write in English, but they are by and large known as Indo American writers or Indian American writers. People like uh, Lee or Amy Khan. Okay, so these people are Asian Americans. So there is a difference, right? So they are writing in English, but because they come from different parts of the world, not from America. Of course, they have assimilated in American culture. Many of them have studied, have got their education from excellent American universities. Notwithstanding that, they are still, they have that hyphenated identity. So we have, for example, Latin American writers, people who are from the Latin uh, American countries, but they are living in America and writing in English. Now, equate the story of Chekhov, Somerset Maugham, O. Henry Munir, or so far as human feelings are concerned, or are they altogether different depending on time and geographical spread? Um, we have to look at, because when you talk about Chekhov, the Russian writer, and when you look at Maupassant, French writer, and then you think of the British writers Maugham and O. Henry, and then of course O. Henry was American, right? Munshi Premchand, Indian. Um, they tackle different themes. Their concerns are largely different. Of course, they all address the human condition, but the conditions are very different. Uh, so we cannot make forced comparisons between among the works of these authors, although all these are humanists and they try to address the various concerns that human beings face um, in society. However, we cannot necessarily bring a common thread or think of a common thread that uh, sort of runs through their works. There's a question. I think I have already responded to American literature period. So, if you look at American literature periods, there is another. While I was telling you about the realistic period and modern period and the jazz age and Hemingway and all, and after that, um, I think we have already done the great dramatists. So there is a period, the modern period, and after the war, we had the emergence of some of the greatest American dramatists. So we have talked about Miller and Tennessee Williams, and of course Eugene O'Neill, Thornton Wilder. So these authors, the post-war author, sorry, I'm so sorry, not authors but dramatists. So the post-war dramatists, and they were more concerned with um, American society in the aftermath of war. Although they are not war writers, but then what it does to man, to the individual, and to his society in post-war America. An American tragedy, Dreiser's American tragedy from feminist perspective. Can we interpret that? Why not? Of course, from a feminist perspective, yeah, and I'm sure that there has been a lot of work done, uh, especially from the point of view of the girl who dies. Okay, the girlfriend. So of course we can interpret if you want to look at that, and it would make for a very interesting reading. Any other question? So somebody asked for main characteristics of American literature. There was a particular period, and which was called the Beat Generation. The Beat Generation, and the the essential period is 1944 to 1962, where people like uh, Allen Ginsberg and Jack Carew, and also William Burroughs and Henry Miller. So they also these are the writers who inspired the so-called counterculture movement of the next 2 decades in America, and American culture and literature. So that is one major period in American literature. So these people were like anti-traditionalists, and they sort of explored lots of themes which are earlier taboo in American literature. So they also unfortunately had to face a lot of censorship and legal issues, legal hassles. But what we see of uh, their, their influences are felt even today in every aspect of American culture, whether you look at its art or music or cinema, and even American sitcoms. So the Beat Generation, and which was followed by the counterculture. From 1940 to 2009, what is the trend in American literature, and who are the famous writers? Well, Jonathan Franzen is a very recent contemporary writer, and he is doing excellent work. So one name that comes immediately to mind, that is Jonathan Franzen. But there are lots of contemporary writers. Many of them are Pulitzer Prize winners from 1940 onwards. As I was just telling you about, the authors of the Beat generation, and much of what we see by way of literature today, uh, it the ideas, the themes owe a lot to the works of the Beat writers, the writers of the Beat generation, Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, and also William Burroughs. So those were the great writers, 1940s till 1960s. Okay, so you have to remember that. And of course, now after the war and after the 60s and the counterculture period, you have people, and then also think of this entire wave of immigrants and who started settling in America, and they started writing in, as you were just talking about, in the English language, living in America, writing in English language. So now we no longer have that so-called uh, the white American writers. So we have black writers. For example, we have Toni Morrison, we have Maya Angelou, the poet, we have mm, uh, James Baldwin, yeah. So and Lauren Hensbury, Raisin in the Sun. So these are the people who have sort of brought attention to the then to the till then marginalized voices, the black voice. So black, and then of course we have the Jewish writings, the Jew writers. So we have Tony Kushner, who is doing excellent work, and of course Saul Bellow. He won the Nobel for literature. So these are so the Jewish writers, and then Norman Mailer, again, he's a right. He is, well, like, for example, I mean, if you think of Norman Mailer, he's like a pop culture icon. He's many things. He's a journalist. He is a novelist. He's a social commentator and whatnot. So Norman Mailer, and then we had more recently we had people like Tom Wolfe, who wrote The Bonfire of the Vanities, and who and a very realistic kind of writer. And then Hunter S. Thompson, who was a journalist, and his brand of journalism is called gonzo journalism. Like he becomes the subject of all the observations and the experiments he conducts. He becomes a part of it. He becomes very actively involved in whatever he's investigating or trying to write about. So his form of writing is gonzo journalism. So those are the major trends from 1940 till let's say the early part of the 2000s. I mean, I cannot comment on the who is writing right now or this year. But I'm sure there is a lot of great stuff going on. But from 1940s till 2000, yes, enormous work. Lot of work has been done. Here's a question: contemporary literature and modern literature, both are they same? Uh, what is contemporary literature? How do you define contemporary? I have a course called Contemporary Literature on YouTube, and I started from the 60s till date. So I started from with Camus' The Fall, and I think the most recent work that I had seen was It was Amy Tan's. Uh, uh, I know why the cage bird sing, and also, uh, I'm sorry, Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club, and Maya Angelou's not I know why the cage bird sings. I'm sorry about that. Her poetry, which she recited at the inaugural of President Bill Clinton in 1991. So I think that was the most recent work of literature, and lot of things in between, lot of works of literature in between. Yeah. Modern literature, I don't know what you mean exactly by modern literature, but modernism is a period, 1914 onwards, and they were called the modernists. Okay, so 1914 till 19, early parts of 1940s, and they were the modernists. And um, they're, they experimented a lot with novel themes, and they also experimented a lot with modern techniques. So modern literature, contemporary literature, sometimes those kind of concepts may be used interchangeably, but they are not always the same. Uh, Explain the concept American Dream. American Dream is also the title of a play by Edward Albee. Edward Albee, who wrote the play Who is Afraid of Virginia Woolf. It is such a controversial, and at the same time such a uh, such an oft discussed concept. It has come to form a part of popular lexicon. What does it mean? It means that in America, it sort of projects an image of America. America is a land of opportunities. It's a free, classless and classless and very just and open society where everyone gets a chance to make a success of their lives. um, in American Tragedy, Reeser's American Tragedy, and it's a critique, it's a subversion of the so-called American dream. So a small town boy with very little education and very little to command himself, but he sees that American dream. He dares to see the American dream, and the rich girl that he falls in love with, she sort of symbolizes everything that is shiny and perfect and beautiful in America. But the question that the critics often ask, this question was also raised in Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, that not everyone can attain success. Not everyone can attain success in America, and if they do manage to attain some sort of success, it comes with a great cost, as we have seen in the work, uh, the price that our hero pays in an American tragedy. Uh, Abreed, is there any specific book about history of American literature which includes all the literary periods? Yes, there are a number of books, and some of the books are available even in Kindle form, and which are not very expensive to buy. So if you would just look up, type in the words history of American literature books, and then you will find a number of books out there, and you can, in hard copy form or in Kindle soft copy form version, you can have access to anything. You want a specific book for teaching? Uh, Well, there is not an anthology of American literature. I don't know how easily available it is. Most of us have access to that book because we go to some of the libraries that are there in our city. So that's the way we access these books. So, not an anthology of American literature. Um, it's a great way to begin American literature. And also, since you're talking about you're a teacher, you want to teach English, Sorry, teach American literature. So yes, that's the way. That's the way. We have time for one more question, right? Yeah, yeah. We have time for one more question. If any student would like to ask, we have time for a question. Okay. So, Urmi Brata. Success story of Dhirubhai Ambani may be claimed Indian dream as counterpart of American dream. Well, remember, we are talking about a very real person, and American dream generally, the way we are talking about in the context of this course, is more about literature. And most of the time, this particular concept has been criticized and critiqued by scholars and by writers. Whereas the person that you have just mentioned, he happens to be a very successful businessman who is a real person. He is not a fictional character; he is a real person. So, um, well, if you think of a great Indian dream where honesty and hard work and determination and extraordinary willpower to succeed can lead anyone to success, then perhaps you're right. But in the context of literature, American Dream has I mean, it comes with its very distinct prices. One more question, please. Anyone? So before we wind up, I advise you to keep looking at your assignments and submit them regularly. And if there are any questions, you are always welcome to send them to the discussion forum. We will be very happy to address them. Um, some of your questions are very specific. For example, the kind of people you want to do research on. I would suggest that rather than looking at an individual author or a writer or a playwright, you focus your attention on particular themes that would be that would give you, more wider perspective to crack research. All right then. Exam will be objective type. Yes, we always get. Yes, exam will be objective type. We are not going to ask you to write any essay type questions. So you have been so far you have been receiving assignments which are of objective nature. So you will get your objective type final exam paper as well. We'll wait for one more. Thank you very much. It was very nice interacting with you. Bye bye.